Karoline Leavitt destroys anti-faith judge crossed right back. He learns the hard way. Karoline Leavitt stepped into the courthouse, the echoes of Sunday morning hymns still resonating in her heart. The small silver cross around her neck gleamed faintly as she moved through the bustling hallway. She had come to observe a local case at the request of the president, a symbolic battle over religious freedom that had drawn quiet but significant attention. As she approached the main courtroom, the air felt tense, thick with anticipation. The crowd was a mix of attorneys, plaintiffs, and curious onlookers, their whispers blending into a low, constant hum. Karoline chose a seat near the front, slipping her phone into her blazer pocket, the cross still visible against the navy fabric. She straightened her shoulders, her mind sharp, ready to take notes for the president. The judge's entrance cut through the noise like a blade. Charles Hargrove, tall and severe, his salt and pepper hair combed back tightly, marched in with the heavy, deliberate steps of a man who relished control. He took his seat, his thin-rimmed glasses catching the harsh overhead lights. Hargrove's gaze swept the room, settling briefly on Karoline. His jaw tightened, a flicker of recognition crossing his stern features. "All rise," the bailiff intoned, his deep voice resonating against the courtroom walls. The crowd stood as one, the collective rustle of fabric and shifting feet filling the air. Hargrove gave a curt nod, gripping the gavel as if it were a scepter. "You may be seated," he said, his tone clipped almost mechanical. The crowd settled, a tense quiet falling over the room. Hargrove leaned forward, flipping through the stack of papers before him, eyes darting over the docket like a hawk. He paused, fingers tightening around a particular document, his expression hardening. "Mrs. Leavitt," he said, suddenly his voice cutting through the silence. "Stand." Karoline's heart gave a slight jolt, but she rose smoothly, meeting his gaze with steady eyes. She felt the curious stares from the surrounding benches, the whispers tickling her ears, but she kept her focus on the man in the black robe. "Identify yourself," Hargrove demanded, his tone sharp, "and explain your purpose here." Karoline took a breath, her voice calm but firm. "Karoline Leavitt, White House press secretary, here as an observer on behalf of the administration." Hargrove's eyes narrowed, the muscles in his jaw tightening visibly. He leaned back, adjusting his glasses, his gaze never leaving her. "Interesting," he said slowly, the word dripping with skepticism. "And what Ms. Leavitt compels a White House official to interfere in local court proceedings? I'm not interfering." Sir Karoline replied, her tone crisp, maintaining her composure. "Simply observing." Hargrove's lips thinned into a cold line. "And is that cross part of your official attire, Ms. Leavitt?" His finger flicked toward the silver cross at her neck, his tone laced with disdain. Karoline felt a rush of heat rise in her chest, but she kept her expression neutral. "It's a personal symbol, Judge, protected under the First Amendment." Hargrove leaned forward, his eyes glinting behind his glasses. "Personal or not, this is my courtroom. I decide what is appropriate here." A low murmur rippled through the crowd, a few heads turning to glance at the small cross resting against Karoline's collarbone. She straightened slightly, her pulse steady but her mind racing. "With all due respect, Your Honor," Karoline said, her voice clear and unwavering. "The Constitution decides what is appropriate, not the personal biases of a single judge." Hargrove's face darkened, his hand gripping the gavel tighter. "Watch your tone, Ms. Leavitt," he snapped, his voice echoing against the courtroom walls. "I will not tolerate disrespect in my court. I'm simply asserting my rights," Judge Karoline replied, her gaze unwavering, "as is my duty." For a brief moment, the air in the room felt charged, the tension crackling like a live wire. Hargrove's jaw clenched, his eyes narrowing into sharp slits behind his glasses. He opened his mouth, clearly ready to escalate, but a sudden, firm cough from the bailiff drew his attention. The man, tall and broad-shouldered, met the judge's gaze with a steady, unblinking stare. Hargrove hesitated, his nostrils flaring slightly. He leaned back, his fingers drumming against the polished wood of his bench. "Fine," he muttered, his voice low but cutting. "But tread carefully, Ms. Leavitt. You may find that this courtroom is not as forgiving as the political stage you are used to." Karoline said nothing, her gaze steady, her fingers brushing the cool metal of the cross against her chest. She slowly took her seat, her back straight, eyes fixed on the judge as he moved on to the next case, his voice sharp, his posture stiff. The room slowly settled back into a tense quiet, the soft scratch of pens against paper, and the muted tap of fingers on phones filling the void left by the confrontation. Karoline took a slow, steady breath, her mind already calculating her next move. The battle had just begun. Karoline sat in the wooden bench, her fingers still lightly touching the small silver cross around her neck. She took a slow breath, steadying herself as the courtroom buzzed with whispers and side glances. Judge Charles Hargrove, seated high above, glanced down at her with a sharp, unwavering gaze. His jaw was set, his thin lips pressed tightly together, as if holding back a deeper, more personal disdain. Miss Leavitt Hargrove's voice cut through the murmurs, each syllable cold and precise. "I will not have my courtroom turned into a stage for your political theatrics. If you wish to continue wearing that symbol, you will face the consequences." Karoline's back straightened instinctively. She had faced down hostile reporters in the White House press room, had stood firm against political adversaries, and had never once bent under pressure. She wouldn't start now. The cross around her neck was more than just a piece of jewelry. It was a part of her identity, a symbol of her faith and resolve. She met Hargrove's gaze, refusing to let him intimidate her. "Your Honor," she replied, her voice firm yet measured, "I am here as an observer, not as a defendant. I have the right to express my faith just like every other American." Hargrove's eyes narrowed, his grip on the gavel tightening. He leaned forward, casting a long shadow over the courtroom. "Your right ends where my authority begins, Miss Leavitt. You may have power in the White House, but here you follow my rules." A tense silence fell over the room. Karoline noticed the older woman typing in the corner, her fingers hovering over the keys, uncertain whether to capture the unfolding confrontation. The bailiff, James Wilson, shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting between the judge and Karoline, sensing the escalating tension. Hargrove slammed his gavel down. "Remove the cross or leave my courtroom." Karoline felt a surge of heat rise in her chest, her pulse quickening. She could feel dozens of eyes on her, some sympathetic, others curious, a few clearly enjoying the spectacle. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her fingers tightening around the cross. She had made a career out of staying composed under pressure, of not letting others dictate her actions. "Today would be no different. I respect the law, Your Honor," she said, her tone calm but unyielding. "But I also know my rights. The First Amendment protects my freedom to express my faith." Hargrove's face reddened slightly, his nostrils flaring. He opened his mouth to speak, but hesitated, perhaps realizing that a misstep here could turn a small courtroom drama into a national scandal. His eyes flicked to the crowd, aware that whispers were already spreading through the aisles. The door at the back of the room creaked open, and a young man in a sharply cut suit stepped in, his eyes scanning the tense scene. He moved quickly to a seat near the front, pulling out his phone, likely preparing to record whatever came next. Hargrove's jaw tightened further, clearly aware that this moment might soon be broadcast far beyond his courtroom. Finally, he leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping the polished wood of his bench. "Fine," he said, his tone dripping with barely contained frustration. "You want to play the Constitution card, Miss Leavitt, then prepare to defend it." He gestured to the court clerk, a thin woman with sharp eyes who quickly began typing, her fingers moving like a machine. "I will not have my authority questioned in my own courtroom," Hargrove continued, his voice rising slightly. "I hereby find you in contempt of court for defying a direct order." A collective gasp rippled through the room, the sound of shifting bodies and whispered disbelief filling the air. Karoline felt her pulse quicken, but she forced herself to remain still, her chin held high. She would not be cowed, not here, not now. $500. Hargrove snapped his gavel, coming down with a sharp crack. "Payable today." Karoline exhaled slowly, feeling the weight of the decision settle around her. She glanced at the man in the front row, his phone now visibly recording the tiny red light blinking steadily. She had become the center of a drama that was rapidly spiraling out of control, a clash between faith and authority that could explode into a national controversy. But if there was one thing Karoline Leavitt knew, it was how to stand firm when the world around her shook. She reached up, touching the cross once more, feeling its cool metal press against her skin. She would not back down. Not today. Karoline felt the weight of every eye in the courtroom, but her resolve remained unshaken. She had faced far tougher crowds, and this judge, no matter how intimidating, would not silence her faith. She took a deep breath, steadying herself, her fingers brushing the cross at her neck, the symbol that had sparked this confrontation. Judge Hargrove's cold stare didn't waver. His gavel still rested in his hand, a silent threat of his authority. The room felt tight, the walls pressing in, every murmur from the crowd amplifying the tension. Karoline could sense the unease, the quiet whispers spreading like wildfire. She knew she had struck a nerve not just with Hargrove, but with the entire room. "You think this little scene intimidates me?" "Miss Leavitt," Hargrove's voice was sharp, each word cutting through the thick air. He leaned forward, his fingers tightening around the gavel. "This is my courtroom, and I won't have you turning it into a stage for your political grandstanding." Karoline met his gaze, unflinching. "With all due respect, Your Honor," she replied, her voice steady, "I'm not here to grandstand. I'm here to witness justice, something that should be impartial, not dictated by personal biases." Hargrove's eyes narrowed, his jaw tightening. He was used to controlling the room, silencing those who dared challenge his authority. But Karoline's calm defiance threw him off balance. She wasn't just another nervous defendant or a rattled witness. She stood with the confidence of someone who had faced far more daunting challenges. "You're out of line." Hargrove spat his gavel, tapping the bench lightly, a restrained warning. "I could have you removed for disrupting these proceedings." Karoline took a step closer to the bench, her heels clicking sharply against the polished floor. She lowered her voice just enough to force him to lean in to hear. "I know my rights, Judge, and I know you're pushing yours." A few gasps rippled through the gallery, the spectators leaning forward, their curiosity piqued. Hargrove's face flushed, a faint red creeping up his neck. He gripped his gavel tighter, the polished wood creaking under his fingers. "Do not test me. Miss Leavitt." He snapped, his voice dropping into a menacing growl. "You are dangerously close to contempt." Karoline straightened, meeting his glare with a steady gaze. "Contempt," she repeated, letting the word hang in the air. "For what? For standing up to a judge who clearly has a problem with a small piece of jewelry?" She touched the cross at her neck again, her fingers firm, a small but powerful gesture of defiance. "This isn't about court decorum, Your Honor. This is about your prejudice." The room fell silent. Even the courtroom clerk paused, her fingers hovering over the keyboard. The security officer near the door shifted his weight, his eyes darting nervously between Karoline and the judge. Hargrove's mouth opened, then closed, his face turning a deeper shade of red. For a moment, he seemed lost for words, his usual confidence shaken. Karoline had hit the mark, exposing the personal bias that had colored his every word since she stepped into the room. "You are out of line," he managed, his voice trembling slightly. "I will not have my authority questioned by a political puppet." Karoline tilted her head, a small smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Authority," she echoed softly. "True authority comes from fairness, from upholding the law without personal bias. Are you doing that?" "Judge Hargrove." A murmur ran through the spectators. Heads turned, eyes wide with shock or admiration. Even the bailiff standing stoically by the door seemed to straighten, his eyes flicking to the judge, silently noting the shift in power. Hargrove's eyes flickered with anger. He raised his gavel, slamming it down with a sharp crack that echoed through the room. "Silence," he barked, his voice breaking slightly, the authority he clung to slipping through his fingers. "I will not tolerate this insubordination." Karoline didn't flinch. She felt the tide turning, the power shifting subtly but surely. Hargrove's bluster had lost its edge, his confidence shaken by her steady defiance. She had seen this before, the moment when a bully realized they no longer controlled the room. "Then perhaps you should start by tolerating the truth," and she replied, her voice firm but calm. "Because that's all I've done here. Speak the truth, and the truth doesn't fear authority, Your Honor." Another ripple of murmurs spread through the crowd, the tension thickening. Hargrove's face flushed an even deeper red, his eyes narrowing with a mixture of rage and fear. Before he could respond, the courtroom door creaked open, drawing every eye. A tall, imposing figure stepped inside, his footsteps echoing against the polished floors. It was Nicholas, Karoline's husband, his face set in a mask of calm determination. Karoline's heart swelled with relief, but she kept her face neutral, her eyes never leaving Hargrove's. She could see the flicker of recognition in the judge's eyes, the slight falter, as he realized this confrontation was far from over. Nicholas took a seat in the back, his sharp eyes locking onto the judge, silently promising that this battle had only just begun. Karoline stepped back, her heels clicking sharply against the polished marble of the courtroom floor. The air was thick with tension, the whispers of the crowd a low, buzzing hum. Judge Hargrove, his face still flushed from their last exchange, leaned back in his chair, gripping the gavel as if it might steady his slipping control. He had underestimated her, and she knew it. As the judge tried to regain his composure, Karoline took a slow breath, her gaze sweeping the room. She caught the eye of James Wilson, the bailiff, standing rigid by the wall. His jaw was tight, his eyes focused on Hargrove as if waiting for the next misstep. In that brief glance, Karoline sensed an unexpected ally, a hint of unease that suggested even the staff were beginning to question the judge's actions. Hargrove cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Ms. Leavitt, this is my courtroom, and you will respect my authority. If you think you can intimidate me with your political connections, you are gravely mistaken." Karoline tilted her head, a slight smile tugging at the corner of her lips. She took a step closer to the bench, her heels echoing in the tense silence. "Intimidate you?" "Hardly. I'm simply reminding you of the law, Judge. You seem to have forgotten that it applies to everyone, even those wearing a black robe." A few quiet gasps rippled through the gallery. An older woman in the back row leaned in to whisper to her companion, her eyes never leaving the confrontation at the front. The man in the I Am King shirt shifted uncomfortably, his confidence shaken by the shift in tone. Hargrove's eyes narrowed, his fingers tightening around the gavel. He leaned forward, his voice a low growl. "Are you questioning my integrity, Ms. Leavitt?" Karoline met his gaze without flinching. "I'm questioning your bias, Judge. You singled me out because of my faith, because of this." She reached up, letting her fingers brush the small silver cross at her collar. "That's not just poor judgment. It's a violation of my constitutional rights." A tense silence fell over the room. The clerk, Mrs. Thompson, hesitated, her fingers hovering over her keyboard. She glanced at the judge, then at Karoline, as if caught in a moral crossfire. Wilson's eyes flicked to the side, his arms crossing tightly over his chest. Hargrove's face turned a deeper shade of red, his knuckles white as he gripped the bench. "You think you can lecture me on the Constitution?" he spat, his voice rising. "You, a mouthpiece for a man who tramples over it daily?" Karoline's eyes sharpened, her jaw setting with quiet resolve. She felt the weight of every stare in the room, the pressure building like a storm. She straightened her shoulders, meeting Hargrove's anger with icy calm. "I'm not here to debate politics, Your Honor. I'm here to stand up for my rights, the same rights you swore to protect when you took your oath." For a moment, the only sound in the courtroom was the soft rustle of papers, the creak of an old wooden bench as someone shifted uncomfortably. Then from the back of the room, a young man in a conservative logo jacket murmured, "She's right." Hargrove's head snapped up, his eyes darting toward the sound. His mask of control cracked further, his jaw clenching as he struggled to regain his grip on the room. "Silence," he barked, slamming the gavel down so hard it echoed off the marble walls. "I will not have this courtroom turned into a circus." But the damage was done. The crowd, once cowed by Hargrove's domineering presence, had caught the scent of his weakness. Whispers spread like wildfire heads, turning eyes narrowing as the tide of sentiment began to shift. Karoline stepped back, letting the tension simmer. She knew when to press and when to let the silence work in her favor. She turned slowly, casting a glance over the faces of those watching. The curious, the skeptical, the quietly supportive. She felt their eyes on her, felt their quiet building resolve. Hargrove's chest rose and fell in sharp, shallow breaths. He opened his mouth to speak, but his words seemed to catch in his throat, his authority slipping further with each second of silence. He had lost control, and the room knew it. Karoline took another step back, her chin held high, her expression one of quiet defiance. She had no intention of backing down, not now, not when she had turned the tide against the man who had tried to silence her. Hargrove's eyes followed her, his face a mask of barely contained fury. He gripped the gavel tighter, his knuckles white against the dark wood. For a moment it seemed he might try to retake control, to force the room back into submission. But the moment passed. The tide had turned, and Karoline Leavitt, standing tall at the center of the storm, knew she had won the first battle. As the courtroom fell into a tense silence, Karoline felt the weight of every eye on her. The whispers that had started when Judge Hargrove first called her out had grown into a low, restless hum. She took a slow, steady breath, feeling the cool metal of her small silver cross against her skin, a reminder of the faith that had guided her through far tougher battles. Judge Hargrove sat back, his fingers tapping against the armrest of his chair, eyes sharp behind wire-rimmed glasses. He had made a critical mistake, and Karoline could see the flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. She had forced him into a corner, exposed his bias, and now the entire courtroom was watching to see what he would do next. Ms. Leavitt, Hargrove's voice cut through the air firm but edged with a hint of caution. You are dangerously close to contempt. I suggest you choose your next words carefully. Karoline stepped forward, her heels clicking against the polished floor. She met his gaze without flinching. With all due respect, Your Honor, she said, her voice steady but sharp. I have the right to defend my faith. I have the right to wear this cross, and I have the right to question why my rights are being singled out. A murmur ran through the room. The older man in the back, the one who had earlier whispered to his friend, now leaned forward, his interest clearly piqued. The woman with the oversized necklace clutched her purse a bit tighter, eyes darting nervously between Karoline and the judge. Even Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, paused her, typing her gaze, shifting anxiously between Karoline and Hargrove. Hargrove's jaw tightened. He adjusted his glasses, his fingers tightening around the gavel. This is my courtroom, Ms. Leavitt. I decide what is appropriate, and your continued defiance is testing my patience. Karoline took another step forward, her posture straight, her expression unyielding. And yet, Your Honor, you've allowed others to sit here with all manner of symbols and statements, she said, her voice rising slightly. You've turned a blind eye to political shirts, oversized necklaces, and every other form of self-expression, but you draw the line at my small cross. You can't hide behind your robe and call this justice. A sharp intake of breath echoed from the woman in the front row, and a few heads turned to see if the judge would react. Hargrove's face flushed a deep, angry red. He leaned forward, his grip on the gavel so tight his knuckles whitened. Enough, he snapped, his voice echoing through the room. You are not the one in control here, Ms. Leavitt. You are here as an observer, not a participant. I suggest you remember that before I hold you in contempt. Karoline felt her pulse quicken, but she refused to back down. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. She had faced more intense confrontations in her career, and she wasn't about to let Hargrove intimidate her now. Then hold me in contempt, she said, firmly, her voice cutting through the tense air. If defending my faith and my rights means facing your judgment, then so be it. But I will not sit silently while you trample on the Constitution. The room fell into a heavy silence, the tension thick enough to cut. Hargrove's face twisted, his mouth opening as if to speak, but no words came. He looked around as if suddenly realizing the weight of the moment, the dozens of eyes watching his every move. Before he could respond, the sound of hurried footsteps echoed through the room. The side door opened, and Mark, the sympathetic clerk Karoline had noticed earlier, stepped into the room, his face pale but determined. Your Honor. Mark said, his voice slightly shaky but growing stronger as he spoke, I need to speak. Hargrove whipped his head around, eyes narrowing. What is it? Mark? He snapped, clearly irritated by the interruption. Mark swallowed hard, his gaze shifting to Karoline, then back to the judge. I've worked here for years, and I've seen how cases are handled. I've seen the fines, the punishments, and the way you single people out for things like this. He gestured to Karoline, his voice gaining strength. It's not right, and it's not just. The room buzzed with renewed energy. Several people leaned in closer, their eyes wide, sensing a turn in the tide. Hargrove's face paled, his grip on the gavel slackening for the first time. Mark, this is highly inappropriate. He sputtered, his voice lacking its usual authority. No, Your Honor? Mark pressed on, his voice firm now. What's inappropriate is punishing someone for expressing their faith. What's inappropriate is using this bench to push a personal bias. Karoline felt a surge of respect for the young clerk. She met his eyes, giving him a slight nod of encouragement. For the first time, it felt like the tide was turning, that the truth was breaking through the thick walls of prejudice that Hargrove had built around his courtroom. As Mark stepped back, the room erupted into low murmurs, the whispers of a crowd awakening to a new reality. Karoline held her ground, her eyes locked on Hargrove, daring him to respond. She could see the conflict in his eyes, the sudden awareness that he had lost control of the narrative. Judge Hargrove took a deep, shuddering breath, his eyes darting around the room as if searching for a lifeline. But there was none. The truth had been spoken, and now for the first time it felt like he was the one on trial. The courtroom felt like it was holding its breath. The walls, once cold and indifferent, now seemed alive with the energy of a crowd on the edge of a monumental shift. Karoline stood at the center, her small silver cross gleaming under the harsh fluorescent lights, a silent challenge to the judge who had tried to strip her of her rights. Judge Hargrove's face had gone pale, his jaw tight, his grip on the gavel weak. For a moment, his eyes flicked to mark the young clerk who had just spoken out, then back to Karoline. The confidence he had wielded so freely earlier now crumbled under the weight of his exposed bias. He opened his mouth perhaps to rebuke Mark, but the words never came. The room had shifted, and the power he once held over it had slipped through his fingers. Karoline took a slow, deliberate breath, her pulse steady. She had waited for this moment for the truth to come to light, and now it was here. She straightened her shoulders, her gaze never leaving the judge. "Your Honor," she said, her voice clear and sharp, "you once said this was your courtroom, that you set the rules. But today we've seen that those rules are not as fair or impartial as you claim. You've targeted me for my faith, and now even your own staff can see it." The room erupted into whispers again, the energy crackling like a live wire. A few people in the back exchanged glances, nodding in silent agreement. Even Mrs. Thompson, the court clerk, who had remained silent through the entire ordeal, now looked at Karoline with a mixture of respect and fear, her fingers frozen above her keyboard. Hargrove's eyes darted around his chest, rising and falling in quick, shallow breaths. He had no easy way out. Every possible response seemed to tighten the trap around him. He clutched the gavel, his knuckles white, the faint tremor in his hand betraying his fear. Before he could regain his composure, Karoline stepped closer to the bench, her eyes locked onto his. "You can find me." "Your Honor," she said, her voice steady but fierce. "You can try to silence me, but you cannot erase the truth. You cannot change the Constitution. You cannot strip me of my rights." Hargrove flinched, his face twitching as if struck. The room was deathly quiet, every person present sensing the turning of the tide. The judge's face, once a mask of smug authority, now looked gaunt and haunted, his power slipping away with each passing second. Suddenly, the doors at the back of the courtroom swung open, and a man in a dark suit stepped in. It was Nicholas, Karoline's husband. His eyes found hers instantly, and he gave a small, encouraging nod. She felt a surge of strength, a reminder that she wasn't alone in this fight. Nicholas walked to the front, his polished shoes clicking against the marble, each step echoing with the promise of accountability. He stopped beside Karoline, his tall frame casting a long shadow over the now visibly shaken judge. "Your Honor," Nicholas said, his deep voice resonating through the room, "I believe it's time we address the real issue here. My wife has done nothing wrong. She has simply exercised her constitutional rights, and you have attempted to punish her for it." Hargrove's face twisted, his eyes narrowing behind his glasses. He opened his mouth, but Nicholas cut him off, his voice rising. "You can hide behind your gavel and your robe, but you cannot hide from the truth. You've shown a clear, unmistakable bias, and this will not stand." A wave of murmurs swept through the crowd, a ripple of agreement that grew louder as more people found their voices. Even the older man in the back, who had watched in silent support earlier, now stood clapping slowly, his eyes fixed on the judge. Hargrove's face flushed a deep red, his jaw working as he struggled for control. He looked to Mrs. Thompson, but she only lowered her eyes, refusing to meet his desperate gaze. Nicholas took another step closer to the bench, his eyes cold and unyielding. "If you continue down this path, Your Honor, you will not just face public outrage, you will face legal action. You will face the very Constitution you've chosen to ignore." The room erupted into full-blown applause, the sound of hands clapping and voices rising in agreement filling the air. Hargrove flinched, the gavel slipping from his grip and clattering onto the polished wood of the bench. His face drained of color, the final remnants of his authority crumbling in the face of a united, unbreakable stand for justice. Karolina reached over and took Nicholas's hand, her heart swelling with pride and relief. She turned to the judge, her eyes blazing with a mix of righteous fury and hard-won victory. "This isn't over," she said, her voice cutting through the applause, sharp and clear. "Not until every person, no matter their faith, can stand in this courtroom without fear of prejudice." With that, she turned her heels, clicking against the marble, as she walked down the aisle, her head held high, her cross glinting like a small silver promise of freedom. Nicholas followed his hand warm around hers, their footsteps echoing the strength of their conviction. As the courtroom doors swung shut behind them, the applause still rang out, a powerful, undeniable testament to the power of truth, faith, and unbreakable resolve.